I just had seen so many bad things happen because with that model that I really wanted to sort of propose something different. I think identity is really, really important. I think it has been for a while. I remember, geez, and I felt like I was even late then, but I did a talk at RSA in 2018 that was entitled, Identity is the New Perimeter, right? And that was, 7 years ago. And that was even at that point was a little bit outdated. But now you see all the attacks, right? They're involving credentials.
Hello, and welcome back to Threats, Pitfalls, and Risk Myths, the TPRM Podcast. My name is Nate Lee, I'm your host, and this week I am so excited to welcome in Jason Chan. He was the head of security, the CISO, over at Netflix, where he built one of the most influential programs in the entire industry. His teams created the whole paved road concept. They're the ones that pushed for the whole guardrails, not gates. They championed automation long before those ideas were mainstream. And then his team went and built, then released open source projects that became the precursor to many of today's modern cloud security tools. We're going to talk about a lot of the thinking behind those ideas and principles and look at where teams tend to misinterpret them. We'll also hear Jason's take on AI, the build versus buy debate, vendor risk, and talk about why identity is quickly becoming the centerpiece of a modern security program. Jason's perspective is truly rare. He's pragmatic, he's deeply experienced, and he's honest about what works and what doesn't. So if you're looking for some timeless advice on building a modern and scalable security program, look no further. I hope you enjoy. Let's jump in. Hello, and welcome back to Threats, Pitfalls, and Risk Myths. I'm Nate Lee, and today we are joined by the one and only Jason Chan. He had built and run the security program over at Netflix for the better part of a decade. Probably one of the most influential security programs, many would say, that has ever struck us. So thanks again, Jason, for joining us. Really excited to talk with you today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Nate. Great to be here.
And I mean, this is maybe the proverbial dead horse that gets beaten over and over again. You're well known for the paved road analogy of making sure that there's guardrails, not gates, and thinking through how do you make an easy path for developers, engineers, to have security be kind of the default way of working. And, that's been kind of internalized by a lot of teams over the years. I will assume because when things like this go mainstream, often they end up being slightly misinterpreted or kind of misused. And I'm kind of curious, just because it's been so many years since this came about and you guys really popularized that idea. What have you seen as far as how that maybe hasn't been implemented in sort of the right way or the intended way that you were originally thinking?
Yeah, I think, and of course, I have no ownership of the phrase, so people are always, willing and able to use it however they would like. I think when I had originally used that analogy, kind of guardrails instead of gates, it was, I think the first time I talked about it publicly was at a conference in 2013. I was really trying to question the design of a lot of our traditional security controls, and specifically in the engineering discipline. So if you think about like a threat model or a design review or a pre-release pen test, those kinds of things, they tended to be very manual. Like they involved somebody from the security team checking somebody else's work and then making a decision whether something could proceed. So I having been really pretty heavily involved in that sort of Microsoft SDL era of security, kind of in the early 2000s, I just was very skeptical that those were the most effective ways. So I mean, the way I thought about it was you're kind of pitting one team against another, right, which creates friction. You're creating the opportunity, or you're making somebody exercise judgment to decide whether something can continue. So I just had seen so many bad things happen because with that model that I really wanted to sort of propose something different. And that's kind of it was really guardrails rather than gates, rather than, hey, we just want to build a bunch of guardrails and keep things safe. It was really trying to question the prevailing wisdom or architecture of controls that was very human oriented, very manual. And I thought, that's certainly, I didn't find it to be effective to begin with, but then I think certainly once you sort of went to, cloud native and you went to high velocity engineering, I think those kinds of, it really, really started to break down those very human driven processes that have tons of artifacts and tons of interaction. So I was really calling for a security program, a security architecture that was much more hands off and was much more kind of built into the system.
Yeah, no, I mean, are there ways that we've seen people say they're implementing this, and then you're like, that's not actually what we were going for there? Because I'm assuming, with any things like this, that it ends up being, whether it's misinterpreted or just people that didn't understand the underlying principle. Are there ways you've seen that sort of tried to be implemented, but in a way that didn't quite fulfill what you were going for there?
I would say maybe more on like the paved road side, and paved road, that was really kind of a broader sort of Netflix engineering, approach. And then I just simply sort of adopted it for security since, we're just another part of engineering. And, the way we would have described paved road was, if you're trying to get from point A to point B, a paved road is a pretty good way to do it. It's not the only way to do it, right? You go off the beaten path and kind of cut your own road. Those are going to have a higher cost and they're going to involve more work on your behalf. So the whole idea with a paved road was, especially in a very fast moving environment, external technology environment. So if we rewind to say early 2010s, right, when cloud was just kind of becoming a thing, it was changing. I mean, it's still changing a lot now, especially with AI, but it was changing quite a lot. So what we were trying to do was say, let's take our collective knowledge and sort of put it out there and then say, look, if you want to get your app deployed and secured and whatever else, right? These are the mechanisms you can use to do that. This would be the paved road. So, but it's not required, right? So I think a lot of people would use that phrase paved road. I would hear about a security paved road when you're really just talking about requirements, right? If you're requiring somebody to do something, that's just a requirement. You're not providing an optional way to solve a common problem. You're just putting down a requirement. So I think there was maybe that's the less of the design of a system or a control and more about, how you talked about it and how you approached it.
Yeah. And to me, like in my mind, it was always, and I don't mean this in any terrible way, but it's to me, it was like developers are kind of lazy when it comes to things like this. And if you give them a nice, easy way to do it, they're more than happy to do that. But if the easy way is one that's going to lead to problems, unless it's something egregious, often they're just going to go for what's the easiest way. So knowing that about human psychology, basically building the system to accommodate for that is always in my mind of, thinking about what the paved road would be.
I do think I feel like that's become more true over time. And, one of the things that I noticed was like early in my career is, developers had this tendency, they wanted to kind of control the whole stack, right? They wanted to understand the hardware and the operating system, because I don't know if it was like a lack of trust. No, you don't get it anymore, right? People are much more comfortable with abstractions and just like this idea of somebody else is going to handle it. And I think as that sort of comfort with abstraction took hold, then it became an easier sell. Because really what you're trying to do with the paved road is you're trying to build trust between an engineering team and a central team. They're saying, hey, look, we've sort of built these things. We think these are reasonable ways to tackle this problem. Go ahead and trust us. Get on this paved road. And another key thing with the paved road is that it's supported, right? So if you choose to solve your problem in a different way, well, it's very difficult to provide support for every single bespoke way somebody might try to solve a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's really special about the way you ended up approaching this is you're kind of accounting for human psychology, right? And it's the same with what you're mentioning earlier, and when you're talking about not wanting to have other development teams think about security first, and when you're talking about building trust with the teams and not having sort of the guardrail or the toll gates. Because it sets up that adversarial relationship, which is not super beneficial to trust. And if teams trust you, they're going to come to you for solutions. They're going to come to you with problems. I think that gets underweighted often when I see other people's security programs. So, I mean, that certainly was a huge, huge move forward. When it comes to the whole idea of not wanting developers to think about, security first, I think that was sort of revolutionary back then, because I think that was when we were in the like, hey, security is everybody's job type of point in time, which, of course, as an idea, sounds great. Everybody's responsible for security. But the realities of that just are that it doesn't really work out terribly well. When it comes to that, though, are there times where, the whole developers shouldn't think about security as their top line issue, where that maybe broke down and what you would want to have to do differently, or how do you identify those situations?
Yeah, I mean, when my perspective on that was, I'm not saying like my perspective was correct, right? It was just, I think you have to choose, right? You have to decide how involved do you want your developers to be. And I think, even if I think about like my own, leadership philosophy, just sort of totally separate from security, it's like, I don't want to make people responsible for something they're not expert at, right? I don't want them making
Yeah.
decisions in an area, in a domain that they're not qualified to do, right? In the same way that, like, my legal team doesn't want me making opinions about legal issues. So I think that to me is the underlying thing. But like you said, I mean, I think I'm not going to say it's purely performative to say that security is like the most important thing, because I think the people who say that, I think they really do believe that. I just think,
Yeah. Yeah.
when the rubber meets the road, it's hard to make that happen. So I would, I would always
Technology is a
lean
terrible
toward,
thing like that.
yeah, that's the thing, right? It's, you're always going to have some developers who are more, they care more about security. They think more about security. They're going to tend to be your sort of like
Hmm.
your allies out there that are deployed out there. I think that's a great thing. I think those are things to be cultivated in kind of an informal way. So I think security teams need to be smart about how they do that, right? They need to think, okay, well, what are the teams that are building or working on the most sensitive systems, whether it's
Yeah.
sensitive in terms of the data they're touching, or has the highest regulatory impact. And then again, I don't know that I would want to spend a lot of time training those folks on like, hey, about security and trying to make them security experts. But those are the ones I'm going to want to make sure are really having the best uptake with whatever I would consider to be my paved road, or the controls I need to have implemented. So yeah, I think people would sort of gravitate towards that model sort of logically, that yeah, sure, the folks
Hmm.
that are displaying the lunch menu, right, that's probably lower on the hierarchy, and then the folks working on the payments infrastructure
Really,
is
that's a
higher.
matter of
So
perspective. I could argue
yeah,
otherwise on that particular case.
lunch is important. I mean, snacks are important. That's one thing that I would miss about working in an office, is having like a little can of M&Ms to sneak.
Yeah, I don't think I'd work well in an environment where there was just bottomless, delicious snacks and free food everywhere. I can see that being counterproductive to my general well-being. And so I'm curious though, like, because maybe tying into that, one of the things, I think you've talked about having security orgs, they should be scaling sort of sublinear to the rest of the org, which is kind of funny because often we see other security leaders like, well, what's the benchmark of like what percent of the IT spend or engineering spend should go to security, which again is one of those things that I suppose sounds good, when you just say it out loud, but then you think about it more, and the whole goal of having a centralized team is that you're offering these services and you can serve an ever-growing number of, whether it's internal clients or external or whatever, but you can serve an ever-growing number without having to scale, proportionate to that number. And I think maybe getting to what we were talking about of, the reality is you can't hit everything. You can't do everything. It seems like AI is going to make it where teams can do more with less. I mean, does that start making it more of a reality, though, that even for smaller teams, they can start scaling sublinearly faster? Because I think there's probably a certain point where you are scaling proportionate or even maybe faster than some of the other orgs. How do you see AI affecting that, as far as empowering teams to build their own stuff?
Yeah, and I think that that's a normal thing. So, once the numbers are when the numbers are relatively small, like you've got dozens or hundreds of employees,
Mm-hmm.
that percentage or ratio is going to be relatively meaningless. And I agree. I think there's a little bit of bootstrapping that a team needs to do, right? So you may grow initially. I mean, I think thinking back to my time at Netflix, we certainly did that early. We sort of, we grew a bit faster, then we sort of dramatically dropped off in terms of our growth compared to the company's growth. Yeah, I have high hopes for AI. I think we're already seeing, its application to security operations or application security, which is going, it's just so much more efficient and effective. That said, I would say, well, what about, AI adoption in the rest of the business, and, what
Mm-hmm.
kind of headaches are they going to provide to the security team? I don't mean headaches as in like, unnecessary. I mean, like these are
To think
important
about.
things for the, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think I would bet on that. Your statement there that AI is going to allow teams to go sublinear faster than they probably could
Mm-hmm.
have earlier. And I also think coupled with that is like the market, like just the number of solutions available in the market now versus say 10, 15 years ago. Like there's just a lot more things you can sort of buy off the shelf that you're not going to have to build internally. So
Yeah, and that's one thing you guys were famous for. I mean, you were building tools because the tools didn't exist, which I mean was amazing. I mean, you had Security Monkey, RepoKit, Aardvark. I mean, you kind of had the least privileged thing automated before people were even really talking about that, and CSPM before CSPM was a thing. Also, the Security Monkey had a really great logo. I just want to call that out. That was a sticker on my laptop for many
that was
years.
awesome.
When it comes to, I guess that build versus buy thing, because one side AI makes it super easy to build things that you might want. On the other hand, like you said, there's a lot of tools out there. They're very mature. They're going to be supported. How do you think about that calculus? Because it is very easy for me to go build something that might solve my immediate problem, and to some extent, people don't want to have tons and tons of tools, but there's advantages. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's important. You mentioned this idea of a calculus. I think every organization needs to have a sort of articulated stance on how they're thinking about build versus buy. And I don't think, necessarily that it should vary tremendously company to company. 'Cause, as you mentioned, like at Netflix, yeah, I mean, the cloud security industry didn't exist, so you have to build some stuff. I think if you were going to do it again right now, then there's much more off the shelf. I think now in terms of, but yeah, to your point of AI making things easier to build, I would say yes, but of course, there's always a but when you're talking to a security person. But any engineer who's better
spot type of situation.
I mean, any engineer who's been around for a while, right? Yeah, it's easy to write something, but then you got to deploy it, you got to operate it, you got to maintain it. Nobody wants to do that, right? So it's like you always have this shiny thing, right? People want to build something new, solve some new problem. They don't want to iterate on something that's been out there. So yeah, I think you got to be pretty deliberate. You have to be, yeah, I think again, underlying all of that is like you have to have an articulated build versus buy stance. And then I think on top of that, you have to have, well, what is your framework for decision making, right? How are you weighing pros and cons and long-term, operational costs, and who makes the decision? So assuming all those things are in place, I think that's going to give you a better chance for success. I mean, in terms of, if I were thinking about it today, I think most of what I'd be building would be, the glue that's connecting the tool.
Yeah.
Either, my procured set. Yeah. You're trying to get intelligence out of the portfolio you've deployed, as well as things like internal inventory systems, deployment management systems, other engineering systems. In my experience, those tended to be great sources of intelligence and kind of operational data for security teams. So I think that's where I'd probably be focusing, and less on the, certainly wouldn't build something like Security Monkey now. There's just no reason.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really important call out is like the value you're going to get from building the glue, because it'd be silly to kind of reinvent the wheel when, CSPM and all these things are going to give you nice interfaces. But it's that whole the business context and all the things that make your company unique, and how do you tie that into all of these disparate systems and turn that into something actionable that aligns with your team and your process. I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense as far as things that people can think about, and where it would be more easily supportable by your team because it's directly related to things you're doing individually.
Yeah.
When it comes to AI, still, again, like there's AI everywhere, right? Like it's not just engineering. Now you have finance people probably using it. You have marketing. Like everybody's doing all of the AI bits everywhere, both in the SaaS tools they're using, but there's more and more I'm seeing people, learning how to do basic scripting and things like that. Are there sort of paved road things that you would consider or that you think make sense in a world where it's not just engineering and, therefore it's also much less centralized, where you don't have you can put something in CI that does something or give them a centralized library. Now you're talking about people who don't know what CI means. They have no clue what it means to pull in a library. Claude did that for me. How do you think about paved roads that would be, kind of broadly applicable outside of engineering, but for organizational security more generally?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I'm personally, I love this idea that, more folks can be builders and can kind of solve their own problems with technology. I think that's just a great direction. That said, again, another but is that it's going to make it difficult for
security. You're really fun at parties, I suppose, huh?
I know. It's just, what's one thing I am glad is glad I don't have to deal with these problems on a day-to-day basis anymore. I can just sort of have opinions about them. But I kind of think of enabling end users, right? So if you think about AI tools for, say, finance or marketing, that to me is part of this unbroken history, going way back, say 2 decades, to what people would call shadow IT, when people were self-procuring SaaS, right? And then, you went into low code, no code. And yeah, when I think about paved road for kind of end user systems, one of the key things with the idea of a paved road is that you need some maturity in the space to know what the right paved road is, right? So I personally think there's just too much innovation happening in the kind of end user AI space right now to say, like, this is our one supported thing. You might have to choose a few. I think, in some time, maybe a couple of years, you're probably going to want to settle on, hey, this is what we're going to use for code generation copilots, and this is what we're going to use for. But I think now, if you really want to harness the value of end user innovation, right, and end user enablement, you have to be relatively permissive to allow them to kind of explore what's going to work for them. Because, again, the sort of origin of all this, the reason why end users are doing that on their own and shadow IT happened and low code, no code happened is because central teams are by definition unable to meet all the demand out there, right? So they're always slightly behind. So I don't think you want to constrain that too quickly. So I would be pretty open-minded and recognizing that, yeah, on that vanguard, there's going to be probably a little bit more risk. But again, when you take risk, there's also the opportunity for reward, right? It's not just downside. So I would encourage security leaders to be pretty open-minded and be like, hey, we think we can actually get a lot of benefit out of this. So let's see what emerges. And then as platforms, and that's typically what happens, is certain platforms will kind of get momentum, right? They'll get some inertia internally. And then you can start saying, okay, well, we want to add this to the page. You can start thinking about licensing and, how do I make sure that the identity is squared away and things like that.
No, perfect. And I mean, I think to your point, like that whole calling it shadow IT was always, I mean, to me, that was indicative of the problem, right? It's like, it made it like the users are the ones that are bad instead of, hey, this is a service we're not offering, whether it's because we can't or we won't, or we don't even realize there's a problem. I mean, it always struck me as sort of framing it, the problem is something different. And I think you're spot on when it comes to accepting some of this risk, because otherwise it seems like security leaders end up being really myopically focused on security risk instead of thinking of business risk as a whole. And if you're not enabling these teams to experiment and use these tools, I mean, you're taking on an entirely different piece of risk. There's a giant opportunity cost to not enabling that and figuring out how you can experiment and learn quickly and stuff. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely the right tack.
Yeah, I think you captured it well there, right? Where we often hear security leaders, they want to be seen as business leaders. Well, if that's what you want, then these are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about. Is you're not just thinking about what's the downside specific to your area, what's the upside, for the overall business.
Yeah. And the risk elsewhere. I mean, I think that's another great point. Is everybody's like, yes, security should be part of the business. I need to be reporting to the CEO or whatever it is, but then they don't really take on all of the other pieces that actually entails. So,
totally.
Sticking with AI, because of course it's the topic everyone needs to be talking about. But I think one of the things you had called out previously was you guys had like a minimum of quarterly sort of cadence for deploying updates and changes and such. With the Anthropic thing that came out, of automated attacks, how does that sort of change how you think about the right pacing and, what's too fast, what's too slow? We've talked about this with other folks, and it's, now you have to worry about, if you're not updating fast enough, the automated systems at some point in the not too distant future are going to be, targeting with custom made 0-day type things. On the other hand, if you patch too fast, maybe somebody's NPM account is compromised and there's a bunch of libraries that, haven't been picked up yet that are nefarious, let's say. How do you balance that? Like, what's the right way to think about this?
Yeah, it's to kind of to provide a little more body around this idea of quarterly deprecation. So we sort of partnered with our productivity engineering teams to sort of create a mechanism where we asked development teams to deploy on at minimum a quarterly basis, and if they did so, essentially we would take care of all their platform framework OS updates for them, and they wouldn't have to worry about patching. Now that was like the minimum, right? Because most teams were deploying weekly, daily, a couple times a week. More stable, more legacy systems might do that. So that was kind of what we would say is the minimum. I think now, yeah, certainly if I was going to do it today, I'd probably say, yeah, you probably want at least, maybe twice a month, that would be more reasonable. And I think partially because the technology exists to make that, pretty seamless. But Yeah, I think a lot of, what security teams, when I think about vulnerability management and updates and keeping your environment in the state you want it to be, right? Because I think a lot of security's work, I mean, sure, there's some of it is hunting the adversary, but a lot of it is taking the environment from the state it's in now to the state you want it to be, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
getting rid of misconfigurations, updating software, whatever. So that's really where the bulk of your energy needs to be. So, and I think a lot of that is just like getting the environment into a place where it can be updated in a safe
Yep. Yeah.
way that's sort of repeatable and is pretty low risk, right? It's pretty like you're not worrying about things crashing or things not working just because you updated a base image.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the just deployment infrastructure that exists now versus 10 or 15 years ago is wildly different. Like you said, it
Yeah.
enables you to move differently. I like the idea of kind of making sure you're moving in the right direction, and kind of getting to where you want to be, because I mean that seems more important than being at any specific place. Is your trajectory in the right direction? Because we know you're going to need to patch faster in the future as automated attacks and things pick up. And I think it's just important for people to maybe be less focused on whatever specific goal and more directionally, where are you going and what are you doing to enable that? So I think that's a very good call out.
Yeah, I like the idea of the direction, and one of the sort of, and I'm very bad at whiteboard art, but one of the diagrams I would draw often, and this kind of is also harkens back to that idea of paved road and kind of end user innovation, and like the end user is always going to be a little bit ahead. The way I would kind of draw it out is like if you think about a fast growing business, right? You're going to be that kind of up and to the right graph.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of a proxy to a bunch of things, right? It's how complex is the business? How many employees do you have? How many physical locations do you have? How many applications do you have? Lines of code, right? They all are going to kind of tend to match that up into the right curve. And security, I think it's our job to maintain some, proximity to that curve, right? So, because when that curve starts growing faster than you're able
Yeah.
to, that's when you run into serious problems, right? So I think it's about, you're not necessarily trying to be ahead, right? You don't want to overinvest ahead, but you want to have a good sense of where the business is going and how fast, some kind of directionally, and how fast are they growing
Yep.
in
Yep.
complexity and size, so that you can make the right investment.
No, I mean, I think that's perfectly accurate. When it comes to vulnerabilities, things like this, I mean, I think one of the things we've been seeing is just lack of clarity as far as like how should people be dealing with vulnerabilities, right? Because I think at first it started where we started getting more scanners and we realized how many problems there were in all these third-party libraries people are pulling in, like, oh my god, I've got 10,000 vulnerabilities, or at least thousands. I don't think is uncommon for people to see if you're looking at all the libraries and such you're pulling in, and there's 80 criticals or 100 criticals. How should people be thinking about this? Because I think clearly that wasn't really an accurate way of thinking about things, and now we end up with these giant S bombs, and nobody knows what to do with them, or reachability analysis. You're spending all the time kind of figuring all of this stuff out. There must be a better way to kind of holistically think about vulnerability management just as a whole. I mean, what do you think about that? Like, how do you approach that as a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I hear a lot. I mean, I talk to a fair number of startups these days, and folks in kind of the venture capital world, and there's a lot of talk about reachability analysis and vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
prioritization and sort of risk-based decision making. And look, I'm not against those things. I think those are all reasonable things to do. But when I think about vulnerability management, your time and energy and resources is going to be spent most effectively in getting the infrastructure into a state that it's easy to update
Yeah.
and easy to manage, right? So like if you have, a bad infrastructure, right, it's really, really hard to secure that. So, you mentioned things like deployability, and, we thought about things like, immutable infrastructure and ephemerality and all these things. Those are the characteristics of an environment that make it kind of easy to keep updated. So I would, I mean, again, I think I'm not going to say like reachability analysis is purely an academic kind of ivory tower thing. It's an interesting, thought exercise. I would rather spend that time in making sure the environment is. I think about the examples I would use are things like Chrome browser, or
Yeah.
Chromebooks, or even iOS, where you as an end user, I'm not going to Apple's site and looking at every single issue and say, oh, I want to update this. I don't want to update this, right? I'm just turning on automatic updates and it pretty much just works. So I think
Mhm.
folks need to think about their infrastructure in largely the same way, is that you can reliably and quickly get it updated. So that way I'm not worrying about, oh, how do I want to prioritize these rollouts? I mean, of course, like triage is always an important part of
Yep, yep.
security, but if you feel really comfortable hitting a button and say update the environment, to me that's like so much better than spending a bunch of time, doing reachability analysis and risk-based decision making on what you're gonna update and what you're gonna keep vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think this is the exact sort of thing, right? That really set the Netflix security program apart, and all the things you did to directionally set them, because it's almost like people are asking the wrong question. It's not, is this reachable? How exploitable is it? What's our risk level? Okay, then where does that go in our, like, all of that time you're spending doing that, you could instead be, the goal is get stuff up to date so it's not vulnerable. And how do we do that? You do it by the leading indicator, which is, how do we reduce the friction, the time to deploy, all of these things? Because the vulnerabilities you have is just kind of a lag indicator that's already, it's too late. You're fixing the wrong problem at that point by the time you're patching. And I think that's just, I don't hear a whole lot of people bring it up this way. So it's super interesting, and something I think people need to hear.
Yeah. I'm honestly like somewhat stunned that our thinking about vulnerability management hasn't moved that quickly. I mean, now there are plenty of organizations I think who really
Yep.
have a good handle on this, but I would say there's a really large kind of trailing population. And there's always, there's people will say there's always reasons, right? You got legacy and you have hybrid environments and things like that. I'm like, you're always going to have that. Every organization is going to have some legacy, some hybrid, something that's a little bit one off. But to me, kind of to your point around, like directionality, like things are always going to change. Are you moving in the right direction?
Moving in the right direction, or are you asking the right questions? I mean, because I think if you're not asking the right question, you're going to come up with an answer that is maybe right to the question you're asking, but it could be wrong for the actual situation you're trying to solve. So I mean, I'm glad we were able to bring that up. When it comes to vendors, because I think that's something we see with a lot of the breaches. It comes from third parties. Your infrastructure was fine, your systems were fine, but whoever got breached, and you have stuff there, they have keys, all of this. I mean, if you were to think of 2-3 artifacts, because we have security questionnaires you could be sending them. Let's assume you are not a big fan of those. What sort of things would you actually be looking at from a vendor that gives you some idea of how you can assess risk and take actions or not? Like what would you do there? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and not to get too wordy, but I would say, underlying all that, I totally agree, right? You're going to have increasing reliance on external parties, whether it's open source or vendors. I think that that's totally the right direction, right? That's why the cloud service providers have grown so much, right? Because people realize, oh, it's actually a lot better to have Amazon worry about data centers and systems and things like that. So I don't think increasing reliance on third parties is a bad thing. I think that that's how you create focus for your business. And I think, given that, right, if you tend to agree with that, like, hey, we don't need to build everything ourselves. We want to rely on vendors to do things for us. One of the things that we talked about a lot, and I really believe in, is like, we call it the Rambo architecture, right? Going back to the movies in the 80s, right? You had John Rambo, basically like everything else could fail, but Rambo's going to keep going. And that was kind of like the idea for a system, right? Is like, you might have dependencies, and those dependencies might fail outside of your control, but you should still be able to like do your thing. So I think that that's the right mindset. And a lot of times people will talk about resilience. I think that's the right approach. Is like, you want to have that idea that, look, vendors are going to have problems. They're going to lose data. They're going to have outages. That I want to do what I can to insulate my business from those things. So when I think about, if that's kind of my underlying philosophy and mindset, when I would say, okay, well, what kind of artifacts or things would I want to have in place? I mean, I think, people will say what they want about SOC 2. I think that's a reasonable, like, third party sort of, documentation around your security program. Do you have that? Okay. I really like the idea of trust portals. I think that that's a really, really nice approach. This idea that I'm going to make externally available like information about my control set, my security program. I think that's a really, really great step for the industry. I think increasingly you want to make that able to be consumed in an automated way, so that I don't need to go physically browse that. I can just sort of consume the state of your
X
security
policy and figure out if this makes sense. And
Yeah, and then I think what I would add to the SOC 2 and the trust portal, I would add you want your terms and conditions in your contract you have with that, because at the end of the day, right, you're going to need to have some contractual obligation. But I think, like, to me, those are the things. Yeah, I would not be investing a lot in assessments and in questionnaires. I think, I talk quite a bit about sort of the idea of surveys and questionnaires generally in security. And me, I was come from a liberal arts background. I studied sociology in college, and I understand, like, there are entire disciplines around how you construct surveys and how you construct questionnaires and how you do those kinds of things so that you get the answers you want, so that they're not biased. And, like, we don't take any of that into account when we're designing. So, like, to me, this whole idea is incredibly flawed. It's point in time, right? People will lie either intentionally or unintentionally. So to me, it's just so
Incentives are not
incredibly flawed.
aligned for them to give you what
No,
you
and I
actually need.
yeah, and I get it. I mean, people want to feel like they can do something, and I think one of the reasons why they've become so popular is that, well, it's an easy thing to measure, right? And in an area, in a discipline that's been relatively difficult to measure, it's pretty easy to measure how many vendors I sent a questionnaire to, right, or how many questionnaires I
And if
filled.
something bad happens, you can be like, we sent them a questionnaire. We asked about it. I don't know what happened after that.
Exactly. I mean, where you see all these outages and things like that, and it's like, well, did your questionnaire help you with that? Probably not.
Almost 100% for sure not. And when it comes to like SOC 2, because I agree, like it gets sort of a bad name, but I feel like the reason that is because people don't actually understand what they're getting when they receive a SOC 2. I mean, often even when they're the company getting the SOC 2, being attested to, they don't understand what it even is. It's like, oh, we're SOC 2 compliant, and you're like, well, it's not really a compliance thing. It's more of a report on what you're doing. And I think people miss the idea that you can get a SOC 2 that says basically anything. And it could be like, oh, yes, we use screen doors because we don't feel like we need heavy doors to keep anyone out because we're in a very safe place, part of town. And the auditor will come through and be like, yes, screen doors in place, check, no exceptions. And people don't realize, that the SOC 2 is more of a description of someone's program at a point in time or over a period of time. And so they're just taking it as a checkbox instead of like actually thinking about what's important for this engagement. What should a company this size have? Like, are they doing that or not? And, they're just kind of flipping through, looking for exceptions and, kind of tossing it in the
But
bin.
yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree with that. But I also think, like, this idea of, well, let me as a buyer sort of
Mm-hmm.
like pontificate about what I think are the right control set for this vendor. Like, yeah, I think you can do that, but I think, to me, if I think about, well, what am I trying to do by sending a questionnaire or reading a SOC
Mm-hmm.
2? Somewhat what you're trying to do is you're trying to predict, is this company going to give me a security problem? Like, are they going to create problems for
Yeah.
me? And I just don't think we can predict that. I think if you would ask a CISO, like, where in your environment are you going to have security problems? They're probably not going to be, and they have full knowledge of their entire
Yeah.
environment,
Yeah.
their entire state, and they're probably not going to, with a high fidelity, be able to say, "Oh, this is going to give us."
They have ideas. They just might not be right.
They have ideas, and maybe it's a coin flip, or maybe it's
Yeah.
60%, and that's an environment you know everything about. So then, if I try to say, okay, well, let me ask a couple hundred questions to somebody else, and then use that as a predictor, it just doesn't, like, you can't get there from here. So, and then I think even if you could, right, typically security teams don't actually have that much say in whether or not the business is going to enter into that business relationship. So it's kind of,
Yeah.
I think, in many ways can be performative.
I mean, I think that's absolutely, if you ask 100 people how many times, they've turned the business down and said, you can't use this. I mean, it's likely going to be 1% or less of engagements, regardless of, we know some of them probably had awful security programs, but it is what
Sure.
it is. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things I wish could be killed off, and probably is a result of asking the wrong questions, which, there's plenty of that in security. And I think, so earlier I sent over the questions to Jason, just some ideas of things we could talk about. And this one came up, and I think I could almost, hear you vomit in your mouth a little bit as I was sending this over. But I was, things that people are doing that, what would you kill off among here? It was like champions programs, a regular cadence for your red team, doing threat modeling workshops for everybody, pen tests before you launch stuff, SAST, things like that. And I'm sure you have strong feelings about this. everything is great in a vacuum, right? Like if it's yes, do that or not, and sure, it probably increases some level of security. Knowing that how you feel about that, maybe you can share a little bit of how you feel about some of these things. But what is the general principle about them that makes some of these things less palatable to you when you think about what you can do when you're building out a program?
For me, the main thing is that I think as an industry, we have almost an unlimited number of ways of telling us we're doing something wrong, right? There's a vulnerability, there's a problem, there's a misconfiguration. It's not hard to find a problem in security. It's much more difficult to have a reasonable and scalable fix. So I want to
Yeah,
spend
yeah,
my time building the fixes. So, I would say, like, and this kind of goes back to when I think about it from like a program perspective, a strategy perspective, it's always about what you're not going to do, right?
Mhm.
That's why, I've used this quote so many times, but, from Reed Hastings, he's the founder of Netflix. He said, strategy is hard, right? It has to be because it's about what you don't do.
Yeah,
So you have people who are, big into AppSec and, oh, we need to do all these things. It's like, well, you don't have the resources, you don't have the time, and you don't have the organizational will to actually do all those things. So instead of like this potential population of 1,000 things, you're going to be able to do 8 of them, right? Do you really want to spend all your political capital on rolling out fuzzing or bug bounty or, whatever those
yeah,
things
yeah,
you're going to do? Because you're really, and because I think a lot of times people pick what they're going to do based on what they did at their last job, right? Or what they heard from
yeah,
somebody else. And I'm like, I want to look at the current environment, the current state, and say, okay, a lot of those things you mentioned they're really in service of building and operating more secure software, right? So if that's my goal, build and operate more secure software, there's 1,000 things I could do. What are the things that I think are going to be most useful in this culture, in this technology stack to get me to that? But I think people, a lot of times, they'll just say, oh, we need to run a champions program or we need to do a bug bounty. And it's like,
hmm
yeah, those things they're fine in the right culture and the right situation, but you need to be real. You need to have really good judgment about what you're going to do, because they're going to cost time, they're going to cost resources, they're
yeah,
going to
yeah,
cost, like, you're going to have to ask somebody to do something. So you want to be, isn't that, it's not to say that you never make a wrong choice, but you want to be really, really kind of thoughtful about what you're going to implement. So kind of a long way of saying, like, do I need another way of telling me I'm doing something wrong, or can I spend more time focused on building in the controls that I know are going to solve my problems and going to reduce the likelihood I'm going to have an issue?
yeah. And I think, going back to we were mentioning earlier, I think it seems like one of the big things you're doing that sort of sets apart your thinking on this is you're thinking about leading indicators and what can I do that's going to have the downstream effects I want, rather than dealing with the downstream effects of like, oh, we have a lot of vulnerabilities, we should make sure we find those. You're more thinking like, oh, well, how are those getting in? What can we do to make that less likely to happen in the first place? And I think, it's one of those things that's easy to say, but it really does require you to sort of step back and think about not only the program but the business holistically, and like, how do we fit into this? What are our actual goals? And how are we going to reach there? Because there's a lot of different ways. Like you said, there's millions of different ways to do this, and there's a lot of vendors peddling lots of solutions, which again, I'm sure are good for potential, like whatever it is they're doing. But it might not be the right question that you're even asking in the first place. And I think it's just really valuable for people to hear this, because if even a few people stop and think about things differently and reframe the question in their head, I think it's that's amazing then. And the work you did 10 years ago is still paying off then today.
And I think you mentioned there, I think it's you want to question your beliefs and your understanding of
Mm-hmm.
what has been done in the industry and what's on sale, right? I think where we're at, and I personally think we're still relatively early in the security space. Like, I think we're still evolving, and I think there's going to be a lot more kind of evolution. So, and again, I think, my particular approach, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I would say, I've spent, decades in this space and have spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I did a lot of consulting. And so that all to me kind of feeds into my perspective and my approach. And that's what I'm willing to kind of put my own kind of reputation and investment behind. Other people can have different experience and go different routes. And I'm not saying that those things are wrong.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I pursue the approach I pursue because that's the experience I've developed and what I believe is going to be most effective. So I think everybody needs to do that. Like, if your experience doesn't lead you to have the point of view that I have, I think that's totally fine, because I think we're still in this where there's a bunch of different ways you could solve a problem. They're going to have, kind of like a different level of investment, different cultural impact, things like that. But I think I would really encourage people to be pretty open-minded and innovative in terms of how they think about solving security problems.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just so true, right? Like it's making sure you're open to kind of the broader experiences, but like, or you at least have access to, all of that inside information about your business, your operations, the current state, what your goals are.
Yeah.
And that's key to informing what's important. But it's just making sure you're actually thinking through, kind of the implications of all of these things, because there's a million things any of us can be doing. And really the art of doing security well is, the art of what you're not doing, because we have so many things, so many problems we can deal with. And so maybe not so few resources, but it's limited like everybody else in every other department. And really the challenge is, okay, which of these are most important? Which of these is going to move the needle the most for me? Yeah. I guess one last question, if we were to think about, going forward, because I think at this point, it's pretty clear everything's changing very quickly. I mean, it's hard to think through where we've seen so much change happen in such a short amount of time. Where would you place your bets, when it comes to an area where, people should really be focusing for the next 3-5 years, whatever? Is it managing identities, with all the non-human identities and agents and things like that? Is it doing better with TPRM and figuring out how we can get concrete evidence and align incentives better? Something with AppSec? I mean, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think, if I sort of go back and think about, well, what am I trying to create, right? And I'm trying to create an environment that, is sort of resilient. And I think identity is really, really important. I think it has been for a while. I remember, and I felt like I was even late then, but I did a talk at RSA in 2018 that was entitled, Identity is the New Perimeter, right? And that was, 7 years ago. And that was, even at that point, was a little bit outdated. But now you see all the attacks, right? They're involving credentials. You mentioned things like non-human identity. So I think identity is and I think partially because it improves security, but you can improve the user experience. So I think it's a great place. But I think all of that in service of creating an environment that's resilient, but you're able to respond to issues in an efficient and professional way. Because I think that ultimately is the measure of a security team is when something hits the fan, like, does your team handle it competently? Does it allow the business to continue without too much opportunity costs?
Yeah. And I mean, the identity space, obviously, lots of companies building and thinking about lots of different things there. I mean, I think for me, that one, I still don't even know what does this look like in 5 years? Because with a proliferation of agents, are they acting on behalf of the user? Are they the user? Are they a service? Like, I don't actually know what that looks like, how we manage it. And it's not so much even least privilege for that agent. It's like in the context of what it's doing, how do you understand the context? Because now that's like some non-deterministic sort of nothing you can parse really easily. And you're trying to do this in real time. I mean, it's a wild challenge, certainly. So I'm very excited to see where that goes.
Yeah. Likewise. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again. Super, super great to talk to you. And as always, and just to hear your thoughts on the matter. So really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Nate.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And don't forget to tune in next week. Thanks for listening to the TPRM podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe and share it with a colleague. You can find more insights and resources over at tprmpodcast.com. And until next time, remember, trust nothing, verify most things, and keep building. That's it for this episode of the TPRM podcast. I'm Nate Lee. Thanks for joining me and my guest today. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app, leave us a review, and share the episode with your peers and colleagues. For more resources and insights on building business-aligned security programs and managing vendor security, visit tprmpodcast.com and connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll see you next time.